Hello 8th graders, welcome to American History. This is lesson 1.1, looking at the New World, and looking at the inhabitants of the New World prior to Columbus. When Christopher Columbus arrived in America in 1492, there were a number of highly developed civilizations already living and thriving in the Western Hemisphere. The three in particular I want to start off with are the Aztecs, located way up here. That would be present-day Mexico. Next, we have the Mayan. Right here in Central America, the Yucatan Peninsula. Remember, a peninsula is a piece of land surrounded by water on three sides. Here it is, jetting out into the Gulf of Mexico. And lastly, we have the Inca. Right here, the Inca, in present-day Argentina, up in the Andes Mountains. All three had developed very sophisticated civilizations at the time of or before Columbus had arrived. The first group I want to look at are the Mayan. And the Mayan civilization was actually around 300 to 900 AD. That means when Columbus came in 1492, they had really already come and gone as a civilization. Notice here on the map again, the Yucatan Peninsula jutting out into the Gulf of Mexico. You can still see today some of their early structures, temples, a very sophisticated group. They are really known for being amazing builders, as you can see here in that picture, and for developing a system of writing and mathematics. They didn't learn the European way or the English way. They developed this on their own. And I believe even more impressive is they had developed a calendar system. They used the stars, the planets, to actually develop a more sophisticated calendar than they had in Europe. Again, the Mayan. They had already left by the time Columbus had arrived in 1492. A second group I want to point out are the Aztecs. Aztecs were the group that are in present-day Mexico. Aztecs were around when Columbus arrived. They were a thriving civilization when Columbus got there in 1492. Aztecs known for being fierce warriors. They were great conquerors. And of course, they're also great builders. They built canals, pyramids, elaborate road networks. Their greatest accomplishment was the capital city of Tenochtitlan, which is located right here. And if you see, here's how you spell it, because I have a hard time saying it. Tenochtitlan right here. Notice you have canals, you have roadways going into this island nation, these large courtyards where pyramids would have been. A very impressive civilization. Unfortunately, like the other groups, they also worshipped a false god, and this here is one of them. He reminds me of Chester Cheetah, but here's one of the false gods the Aztecs believed in. And the third group are the Incas. And the Incas lived here present in the Andes Mountains, present-day Argentina. Here you can see a closer view. They were also around when Columbus arrived, thriving between 1200 and 1500 AD. These pictures that you see here, these two maps, this is Machu Picchu. Two great preserved areas where they lived, a hot tourist spot today. And the Incas were known for being incredible craftsmen, making fine metalwork, pottery, textiles or fabrics, developing these, could you imagine, 1,000 years ago? And their ruler was called the Inca. They worshipped one of their own, a fallible man. It's an unfortunate thing about some of these early civilizations is that they had false gods. Now, when looking at Indian groups as a whole, I want us to keep in mind they're not all the same. They're very distinct groups. They represent hundreds and hundreds of different cultures and ways of life. Well, there's two main general identities I want us to consider. One is nomadic. A nomadic Indian is somebody who is always wandering. They are always moving. They are in search of game, fish, wild plants. The nomadic Indians live in teepees because they were easy to take down and move to the next location. They're basically tents. They would use animal skin, animal hide, so they could easily wrap it up and move it to the next location. Other groups of Indians were, of course, more permanent, and they would create more permanent housing, more like a wigwam that they could live in. That was a more, again, more settled areas. Keep in mind those two distinctions. Of course, the Aztec, Mayan, and Inca were definitely more of a permanent civilization. Now let's transition into North America. And what were some of those early civilizations like? Who were they, and where did they live in North America? I want to begin by looking at the Woodlands Indians. The Woodlands Indians. And they were located right through here. The eastern part of the United States, from the Mississippi River to the East Coast. These guys were known for being hunters, fishermen. They also planted a lot of maize, squash, tobacco, and they lived in wigwams. You see the inside of a wigwam right here, and here's an outside of one, a more permanent settlement. These wigwams were made of leaves, bark, animal skin. A more permanent establishment. So the Woodland Indians were here, a thriving group in North America, when Columbus and the other Europeans began to settle here. A second primary group were the Plains Indians. Notice right through here in America, they were located between the Mississippi River in the east and the Rocky Mountains to the west. They were known for hunting buffalo. They were primarily a nomadic group, meaning that they were moving from place to place and thrived with the introduction of horses. They were also livers. They lived in teepees. Because they were moving from place to place, they would live in teepees. So, the Plains Indians. Again, nomadic buffalo hunters. I think one of the more fascinating groups were the Southwest Indians. These guys were awesome. They're living in incredibly dry climate, desert conditions, but they made it work. They would gather from wild plants, and they hunted small animals, whatever they could do to survive, and they knew how to live off the land. And they made their houses out of adobe. Adobe is a dried clay and straw, and others were cliff dwellers. Can you believe this? This is real life stuff. They built their homes into the side of cliffs. And they were phenomenal at making pottery and weaving different kinds of grasses, making baskets, all kinds of things, were the Southwest Indians. Fourthly, we have the Great Basin and Plateau Indians right through here. They'd be sandwiched between the Rocky Mountains and the Cascade and the Sierra Nevada Mountains. They mainly lived in teepees, hunted buffalo. Some, though, lived in hogans. Hogans. These were covered lodges. Check these out. Built into the ground. Pretty cool stuff. So some in teepees, others in hogans. If you're in a hogan, you're a more permanent settler. The climate was often way too harsh for them to farm, so they would often gather nuts and berries, whatever they could do to live. And one cool feature we find from some Great Basin and Plateau Indians are these hieroglyphics. These here were found in Utah and really show many different aspects of the Great Basin and Plateau way of life. A fifth and final group that I want to look at are the Northwest, West Coast Indians. They lived right through here, the West Coast. The Pacific Northwest Indians, those living up in Washington, Oregon, they built sturdy homes and villages. They would create their villages along rivers and streams in the ocean. Why? Because of fishing. It was a great way to gather their food. Also, they could travel along those waterways. They ate a lot of salmon, a lot of oysters, and other fish products. And they were also known for making totem poles. Totem poles depicted many different aspects of their life. These Indian tribes would carve in pictures of things they didn't want to forget, important things in their culture and in their history, and they would remember those through these totem poles. So each of these parts represent something different to that West Coast Indian tribe. So there's 5 main tribes, all in North America, but distinct from one another. They took advantage of where they lived to help them survive. And then one real negative of a lot of these Indian tribes was this idea called animism. Animism is the belief that God and spirits were in nature, and they actually would worship nature, believing that God and spirits lived in them. Also, there were priests, or these called shamans. They're wise men or sorcerers. They supposedly spoke with these spirits. And they'd pray to the weather gods, hoping for certain kinds of climate to help with their crops, to help them against war and disease, praying for a good harvest or a productive hunt. Instead of worshiping the one true creator, they worshiped the created, and were really lost in that, which is unfortunate. But a fascinating group the Native Americans were. They were here, of course, well before Christopher Columbus and Europeans began arriving in 1492. And it's important that we remember their contributions to America. So, this is 1.1. Next class, we're going to have a quick quiz on 1.1. Feel free to watch it over and over again. Come with questions if you have any about this material. Have a good one.